Hello and welcome back to Jessie Kate Creates. Today we're going to be making a clean and simple card using this thank you die set from Spellbinders, and we're mainly featuring that bird. So I've gone ahead and taken the die and cut it out of 110-pound cardstock. I went ahead and cut 3 out, but right now we're only going to need 1, so we'll set the other 2 aside. To color in this bird, I'm going to be using alcohol markers, and really the only alcohol markers I own are these Spectrum Noir Basics markers that I bought at Tuesday Morning a few months ago. I don't have many colors, so these are actually the only 2 blue markers, alcohol ink markers that I have, but I thought they'd work nicely for this project. So the first thing I'm going to do with my bird is draw in some detail. So I'm really just drawing in some wings on my bird. Because this is such a clean and simple card, I did want to add a little bit of extra detail. So I'm taking in my pencil, and once I get those wings where I like them, I am going to erase it so that we're just left with a very faint pencil line. And that's just because I don't want the pencil to show through on the finished bird. So as you can see here, that pencil line is very faint, which is exactly what I wanted. So to color in the bird, I kept it really simple. I took the lightest alcohol marker and colored in the body of the bird, avoiding the feet and the beak so I could color those later. And I'm going to speed up my coloring here just because I'm not expert with alcohol markers by any means. I'm really still learning, and all of the shading and coloring that I'm doing is pretty basic. So I'm trying to keep the darker color on the belly of the bird and just around the wings, just so there's some shading and some definition. So I'm just going back and forth between the 2 colors until I get the bird looking how I like it. I will say for this card, I was really inspired by things that were already on my desk when I was making it, and I had been using some alcohol markers for another project. And I'd used the bird in another project as well for a card for a friend. So I figured I'd go ahead and give this a shot. So once I've colored in the bird, I'm just going to take an orange marker from my alcohol markers and color in the beak. And I'm going to take a brown marker and color in the bird's legs. And I did use a little bit of the lightest blue color to blend the legs just because it looked really stark going from that blue to that brown. So now that our bird is all colored in, the last thing to do is give our little birdie friend here an eye. So I just took a marker that was on my desk to draw in the eye of the bird, and I probably used a marker that was a little bit too thin, so I had to kind of fits and fuss with it for a second to get the eye how I liked it. But once that's done, our bird is complete. Now that our bird is colored and ready to go, I'm going to move on to the background of this card. So we're going to do a little bit of embossing. I have an A2 panel of 80-pound cardstock, and I also have this Spellbinders embossing folder that creates a very lovely woven pattern for the card. The embossing folder doesn't quite cover the entire card panel, so I decided that I would trim the panel down so that it was 4 by 5 1/4. That way the design stretches across the card panel, and when I adhere it to my card base, it will have a nice little border. When I'm making clean and simple cards, I think tiny extra details can go a really long way. So for a card like this where there's a lot of white space, using an embossing folder adds some interest to the card without bringing in a lot of color or busyness to the card. Also, trimming it down so that there is a little bit of a border on the card adds a nice simple detail as well, even though it's all just white. So I've gone ahead and taken my ATG gun and used that to adhere my panel to my card base. And I don't think I've mentioned it, but for my card base, I am using 80-pound cardstock. Sometimes I use 110-pound for my cards, but I happen to have this base already on my desk and figured I'd go ahead and use it. So now we're going to go back to our bird. I really wanted the bird on this card to have some dimension to it to add extra interest, but I thought cutting out foam tape and using that, especially on the tail of the bird and its tiny little legs, would be too much work. So I figured it was just a lot easier to stack some of these die cuts together to add a little bit of dimension. And as you can see here, I'm just using wet glue to do that so that I can take my time and get those aligned nicely. And once those are all stacked together, I'll go ahead and put them under a heavy block and set them aside so that they have a minute to dry. And while our bird is drying, we are going to work on the sentiment for this card. So I have a scrap of cardstock, and I have this stamp set called the Sentiment Sweet Thank You from the Greetery. I absolutely adore this stamp set. It has thank you in so many different fonts, and it has some really nice sub-sentiments, but I went with a simple thank you so much. And I'm using this Rain Cloud ink from Ranger. It's a nice gray color, and I got this ink pad from Tuesday Morning. So I'm just going to stamp that onto my scrap of cardstock. Don't ever throw those little scraps away. They're so useful when you're making cards. So I decided, as a little extra detail, I would cut a fishtail into my sentiment strip. So I'm just using my scissors to do that, cutting a slit down the middle and then cutting from corner to corner. And I figured that was the easiest way to create that fishtail. So with that done, all the elements of our card are completed and ready to assemble. So I brought in my card base and spent a second just kind of trying to figure out where I wanted everything on the card. And I liked it kind of with the sentiment aligned to the right edge and the bird on top kind of looking like it was perched on the sentiment. I thought about popping up the sentiment on foam tape, but in the end I decided that I actually liked it a lot better with it just flat down. So I took some glue and adhered that to the base just so I had a second to wiggle it around if it wasn't exactly straight, but really I'm just eyeballing it here, and whatever looks good is what goes down. I did the same thing with the bird, just using some wet glue to adhere it to the base. And once those two are on, then it'll be time to add some sequins. I don't know about you guys, but adding sequins to a card always seems to be the hardest part. I spend so much time like fussing over where exactly the sequins should be, how many sequins should be on the card. It's like a 20-minute process that why do we do this to ourselves? Am I the only one who does it? Do you guys do it too? If so, let me know in the comments below. For your sake, I skipped the part where I was deciding exactly where all the sequins should go and kind of just went to the end of that process. So I aligned those how I liked them and then used some wet glue to adhere those down. I'm also using a jewel picker here, and let me tell you, for the longest time I did not have a jewel picker. I just used tweezers or I used my fingers, but my sister does nails and she has a jewel picker, and I borrowed it a few months ago and I loved it so much. It made it so much easier. So she actually got one for my birthday and I love it. So if you don't have a jewel picker, I would highly encourage you to get one. And with the sequins added to the card, that completes the card, but we're not done quite yet. I wanted a matching envelope for this card, and so I decided I would emboss the flap of the envelope. So pretty simple here, just putting it into that same embossing folder that we used to create the background of the card and running that through my Cuttlebug. I haven't ever embossed on the envelope or on the flap of an envelope before. Usually I emboss on cardstock and then adhere that to the flap of the envelope. But it worked out fine doing it right on the envelope. I love the way it looks, and I love that now the card and the envelope match. So that completes the card for today. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you next time.